Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. I'm Gary Berg-Cross, co-organizer, co-champion of this with James Overton. Um, and it is March 29th, 2023. And this is a session as part of our Ontology Summit, which was planned to be presented by Martin Skeevlin from Oslo. And I was contacted this morning that Martin has come down with an illness and he thinks it's a flu and did not feel like he could present today, asked that he be delayed for a couple of weeks. And so we're working through that. In his place, I've suggested that we have what's called a synthesis session. We often have these sort of midway through and then at the end, which is an effort to organize some of what we have heard and learned and thought about and discussed uh, as a working product towards what we call a communique, which, as I mentioned earlier, you might have heard earlier, is often published and we expect to be published in the Journal of Applied Ontology. So for those people who want to experience part of this synthesis activity, have thoughts maybe, please stay tuned. But if you are just here to hear Martin, and then please look at our website when we determine the best date for that, and come back then. Next week will be a session on schema.org, or it's called scienceonschema.org. It's sort of like an expansion from the bioschema approach to the earth sciences, and I think that will be a very useful discussion on sort of the semantic resource at the end below ontologies feeding into ontologies and how that can be useful. So with that, let me start by sharing my screen. I created a few slides to help guide this discussion, or at least from my perspective, sort of put together some ideas about a discussion here. And there is a version of these in PDF on the website, or there will be shortly. I've added one slide since I gave Ken these slides, but we can update that as needed later on. So this sort of outlines some of my initial thoughts on what we might cover, which is, and I have slides on things that relate to this, going back to our vision, which is a better use of various resources like tools, methods, and standards for ontology development, particularly for people who are not ontologists or specialists, but are scientists and researchers who want this for one reason or another. As part of our summit, the first half of it has been to see what has been done in the biomedical area, and we see that as a community acting in an integrated and convergent way. And I have slides that will summarize some of that again. We can talk about that. And we heard from other disciplines and communities after that, particularly from earth sciences, and particularly again with the idea of ontology design patterns. And as part of our discussion then, it seemed to be very little sharing between these two areas at the present time of even design patterns. But we hope that this might provide a little bit of a bridge, and maybe they can share templates and some other tools and methods, certainly, as part of that. I expect that might be part of what we will write up in our communique. As it says below there, how do we bring these types of efforts and other efforts together? What do we need to do to organize and express what we have discussed and learned, and put it into our communique? Is sort of a part of what we're trying to do here. And we hope that there will be some joint work ideas to report on. And indeed, I think we heard last time from Kogan that he was in contact with some people in the biomedical field about some joint possibilities, and maybe we will hear more about that as we go on and be able to include it into our communique. So here is, just for people's memory refresher, here is sort of a very high-level overview of the first part, which James organized in terms of examples from the OBO field, OBO Foundry area. We started out with a high-level reference model for the biomedical field from Chris Mungle, and then James himself talked about a tool that he was essentially the instigator for and the lead for, which is the robot. I've sort of put my own little thoughts about these things in terms of broad areas where they fit in. So that in terms of Cobb, the Foundry ontologies sort of are bottom up from data, from biomedical data, but there's a philosophical top within OBO, and Chris and others have organized this core ontology for biomedical that's sort of an upper reference model, but below the very high level model that allows one to talk about the biomedical domain better. And that, in a sense, organizes and grounds things and sort of builds in some degree of interoperability, I believe. Robot, on the other hand, broadly allows a variety of management activities for ontologies. James can sort of clarify and expand on that as needed. We heard about the ontology development kit for development from Nico, and Nico is, I think, in communication with Kogan about some joint interests. So they're maybe both interested in sharing design patterns and approaches and see where they can merge. That will be interesting to hear about. Yes. And then we heard about OBO dashboards, which I think is very important, from 3 people. That helps us sort of evaluate the ontologies that are sort of gathered together in one place and a part of the community, and helps us understand them. We heard then from the Ubergraph from Jim, which provides a SPARQL endpoint into the ontology, the OBO ontologies, and essentially it's a triple base. And then we ended up with a panel with Chris, Kogan, and Christoph that James moderated. And among the things that were there is a search for what is common. How do we support reuse? What do we think about the various tools that come out of the OBO Foundry? What can be broadly adopted and things of that nature? There's more to be said about that over time, I believe, but we didn't necessarily get as far as we would like to be able to converge these, but it's perhaps a start. The second part of the schedule is we're sort of midway in, and so I won't necessarily go into details about them. So we are here at the 29th of March with now a synthesis session, and we were going to be having science on schema.org and another panel, and then Martin eventually, perhaps at the 19th, and then another synthesis session, and then a communique. We did hear, for example, last week, we had 2 sessions on Wikidata as a resource. And among the things that we saw there were that it had very different ideas about domains that might differ quite a bit. So it's one of those sort of noisy resources that we might use. In particular, it might be used for knowledge graphs. It might be used to inspire some work in like the input vocabularies. And, well, these are where the data, this is what the data is for this particular area. This is what has been said about it. Maybe that's a start for ontological development. Okay. This is a slide which just repeats a little bit of the summit vision that James formulated for this. So as we say, we're trying to help people who are not specialists, but are doing research, such as in the biomedical field or the earth sciences field, scientists and researchers, and essentially make it a little bit easier to get involved in this and understand what resources they might need, both semantic resources and organizational resources. You could just take a look at that. Again, these are some of the things that the first phase at least started on. And we can talk about any one of those as necessary later on. As part of the panel, I sort of developed a few slides that gave a little bit of an overview for the panel to discuss. And this is that slide, which sort of which shows you sort of from an OBO Foundry point of view, this triangle, or really this pyramid of activities, starting at the bottom, because it's bottom driven by data, and where some of the talks fit in, going all the way up to the top level, which is the Cobb, for example. So I find this a very useful diagram, and I'm sure a version of this will be in our communique with some more discussion. Martin would have been talking about ontology templates. The framework is called OTTR. And this is a little bit of a slide on OTTR And if I can turn back to the prior slide, I'll show you why I have it right here. Because in this particular part up here, where it's talking about shared design patterns, which is sort of what's a common a topic between the first part and the second part, they have this thing called OTTR right here as an acknowledgement that they are sort of, the community is into this or understands something about that. So I think that Martin's presentation on OTTR in the future might provide a very useful point of merger of interest, and hopefully the second panel will also have an opportunity to sort of come back to this. This slide just is a very high level summary about what OTTR is about. It's a starting point. A template is a starting point for populating a knowledge base, improving the quality of those, helping people understand, communicate, visualize, and so forth, things of that nature. So that will be, we'll hear more about that in a week or a couple of weeks. One thing that I wanted to sort of just say is something we haven't had a presenter on. This is from Provida Villan, who I've in the past I've contacted her about presenting, and last time I did that, her schedule was filled up several months ahead, so I didn't contact her early enough, and I haven't contacted her this year. But I do find their work on ontology methods interesting. And if you just look at this broadly, a question might be, if you think about the pyramid that the Yobo Foundry sort of presents, where do the tools and where do these processes fit in here? I'm not sure how much work has been done to sort of do that. I mean, there's obviously an implied methodology behind the Yobo Foundry work that it could be mapped to this in some way. I often develop a paper after the communique to going into more detail on a particular topic, and this one sort of appeals to me as trying to bring together some of what we heard here within what's been said about ontological methods, methodologies, and development. So it might be something that both the communique will handle, and maybe that I will, maybe with help of others, try to do more about. This is just another slide from Maria Keat, which goes into more detail about some of the pieces that go into this, including ontology design patterns, which you see here, and makes more distinctions about semantic resources and so forth. So again, part of my thinking and impression from what I'm hearing is that some of the discussions that are published this way about methodologies could sort of be aligned with and filled out with things that are going on with the Yobo Foundry and with other parts of the community, such as the ontology, the design pattern area. This is a slide that I've annotated that I used a little bit before, talking about the Yobo Foundry community itself and some of its values, such as being open, logically, developing ontologies that are logically well-formed and scientifically accurate. And I just have a box here on the comment is that other communities may argue for this too, that they've done that too. But are the two communities interoperable is a big question that keeps occurring. So if that's sort of part of the communities, the library of ontologies here, other communities might argue that they are developing libraries, particularly from ODPs, that are also that. But are the communities, those communities and the Yobo Foundry communities, developing interoperable things themselves? And one way of doing that would be to make sure that some of the upper reference ontologies are looked at to be able to make them as common as possible. So obviously in the biomedical field, you're going to have biological entities, but you are going to have space and time. Another field like earth science, you're going to have, in some cases, you're going to have environmental and biological things, but you're also going to have more on geofeatures and things of that nature. So the question is, can we sort of build out a sort of a integrated upper level reference if we broaden biomedical into biomedical environmental earth oriented? So that's an open question. And again, then there's the idea of principles about collaborative development. And are there examples of collaboration outside the community that is in between communities that are broader than biomedical to other areas? And again, I mentioned that there's some mention that this might be starting, and I hope that we are a seed for some of that. So this is the slide again I took from one of the OBO presentations, not as part of here, but another presentation as part of the probably the annual meeting they have. And I just thought it's a very good layout of some of the roles that are involved in ontological development. What I've added, for example, is if you have the idea of a database curator, well, then we heard last week about Wikidata. That's another source of data. And so people are annotating data sets, but data sets are becoming part of Wikidata. So there may be another aspect of it, a role for that database curator to do here. And then we have the ontology curator, for example, develop and maintaining ontologies, adding terms and so forth. They might use the robot tool, for example, to do that. But it also is about adding terms. So there's some degree of glossary and semantic harmonization that it may be needed back in this particular role. And there may be tools that are available to help people with that. So again, this would also relate to overall ontological methods, where these roles come in and what they play. This slide is talking about if you take a bottom-up approach, as Yobo Foundry does, and knowledge graph developers do, it's a hard task. Very different communities have different bottoms, as I've mentioned before, but they may have a shared upper level, a middle, if you want, not the highest level, but a middle. And so that seems like part of a message that we want to talk about, how to do that, where that might take place. The second bullet notes that it's hard to reach any type of agreement within a diverse culture like the Yobo Foundry, the biomedical. I just added, okay, I understand that degree of difficulty, and they're doing a good job trying to handle that. If we try to sort of broaden things out, we add more communities, and we make harmonizing and agreeing even more difficult. And so I understand why we might have walls and essentially have some degree of silos. And so it's important to understand that, maybe benefit from the experience that Yobo Foundry has had in trying to break that down. And again, going back to common templates and design patterns in an effective way, or experimenting with them, or trying to develop a common methodology we agree on with the various roles we agree on and the various practices that are covered at each step of the ontological engineering process may help us. Along the way, it's noted that a high degree of expertise is noted in some of the challenges. The last bullet says it's very difficult and costly to determine whether any given ontology implements the recommendations of the community. And I say, hence, a need for a dashboard overviews by the community. And I like this in particular. So I'm just, again, reusing one of the slides from the dashboard presentation. And I just added your ontology here, because down the left side, the left column, is the list of ontologies. And then along the top is the various factors that the dashboard allows you to see. Do we have definitions in there? For example, are the relationships explicit and understood? Do we take into account users and so forth? All the things you see along the top. I don't know any other effort that sort of does this type of thing, but in terms of identifying, understanding the quality ontologies and possible relationships, I think this is really important. So, I would think that other ontology developers would want to use something like this, or use this. Exactly. This slide is just sort of where I think I will stop right now. And open it up for discussion. I haven't looked at the chat while I'm doing this, because it's filling up my entire screen. But why don't I stop sharing at this point and see what comments and questions there might be. And hopefully, if there are questions, there are people somewhere who can actually answer them. So let me look at the chat here. Okay. Okay, it talks about using the SOAP hub, and I'm looking at that now. As usual, Ravi has comments, if not questions, and Mike Bennett has his hand up. Okay, thank you, Mike. Why don't you speak up?
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, thanks for the shout out earlier. I just thought I'd quickly mention, so I've recently taken on the role at the Object Management Group as the technical director there, and we're starting to see some ontology standards there, what we call the commons, actually common terms that were originally in FIBO and so on that are reusable for things like codes and identifiers and things. No top level ontology because this is very semantic web data focused. But the kind of ecosystem we saw several presentations of, the robot and the ontology development kit and so on, very similar to what we originally developed for FIBO with the way you use GitHub and forks and pull requests and tie that to change notes and so on. And interesting to see this convergence between what we did in FIBO, what we need to do in OMG and haven't built out the capabilities for yet, and these robot and oak and ontology development kits and stuff that you folks are doing. So yeah, I just wanted to comment there that there's a kind of a commonality in process that we can perhaps even converge further on with things like common metadata and standardizing some of that stuff, and maybe a role we can even play in the standards world that might help with some of that. So I just thought I'd sort of mention that by way of saying hello. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that look ahead. We did sort of as a community talk about earth sciences. We didn't really talk about business and finance, which we often do in our summits. I'm just wondering also, whether there's something that we're missing there. Are the tools, for example, that the Obo Foundry has, does the business finance have things that are equivalent, or are there gaps, or there's an interest in possibly reusing some of that? How much of ontology design patterns are used in the business finances area?
Yeah, so the finance itself, FIBO, has got a very sophisticated system that the EDM Council has developed and continues to develop for kind of automating that stuff. So we have the automated publish when you do a git commit, for example, it runs certain tests, and then when you have a pull request accepted, it publishes certain things. What we're looking at, the object management group itself, where we've extracted some of the stuff that's not limited to finance for reuse in retail and other areas, is kind of where I'm focused at the moment, and that's where I'm seeing the commonality with what we saw several presentations of robot and oak and ontology development kits and so on, that we need to learn from you guys, we at the OMG, in terms of how we can reuse some of that. So but yeah, FIBO itself does use ontology design patterns because they rejected the idea of a top level ontology, which is something I believe you do need for, at least for capturing the real meanings of things. It's more sort of pragmatically focused. So kind of like your methodology you mentioned when you start with the data, it's very middle out, and they're using a lot of ontology design patterns to do what you would otherwise do with top level ontologies. So it is worth keeping an eye on FIBO on that. But yeah, I was just talking more about the need for folks like us at the OMG to kind of maybe look to you guys for guidance for how to have a simpler set of mechanisms than perhaps the EDM Council have developed, but something that standardizes how we manage changes and automated updates and publication and so on of ontology resources that particularly are common across a whole set of domains, or that are reusable across different domains and so on.
Does FIBO have anything like a dashboard to look at the various ontologies that are developed as part of it?
Sort of, yeah. The EDM Council site has various views that are auto-generated by this sophisticated publishing mechanisms they have. We used to have something a lot simpler where we would generate a dictionary and a SCOS resource and so on that you could look at. But yeah, what you see when each time the Git main branch is updated is you see a set of folders, because it's very modular. So you say a set of folders and subfolders for the different domains and modules within that are, each namespace fragment corresponds to a folder. That's turned out to be quite a handy way of managing a very large, very modular ontology. So you get to see those. I'm not sure if that's what you mean by dashboard as such. But yeah, you always
okay.
want to see the latest.
So it sounds like you might have some inputs that could go into a dashboard as a front end. Before I turn to Ravi, Janet said she's going to have to leave, and she also makes a comment. So I'm just wondering, Janet, do you have anything to add, comment on before you go? Maybe she actually has gone already
Yeah,
and just has
but
kept the connection open.
She did post some things on the chat. One is a link, and she mentioned something about integration between Wolfram Alpha and LLMs. And I wonder what LLM means.
It's language models.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. All
Yeah, that
right.
was recently announced. I was thinking of looking into that at some point, but I haven't gotten to that. But that would be interesting link application, sort of knowledge on the one end and well, various types of processing on the other end. But Ravi, you've got several comments in here, so why don't you start and see if anybody else wants to come on too.
I just want to throw some discussion points for comments by our participants on this very interesting synthesis topic that has come, which has brought to me three very good things. One is, what are the common points, say, for example, between earth science disciplines, use of ontology, and the biomedical community of ontology? So, because they both are maturing in their own different ways in ontology applications, tools, methods, processes. But glad to know that Mike Bennett has brought in the finance discipline also in general, and FIBO in particular, as another example of possible commonalities. And what are we talking about commonalities? Repurposing, reusing, or modifying and reusing tools, processes, standards at places, and other resources that we have generated during our ontology development and use process. So scientists, user communities like clinical disciplines in biomedical case, these can benefit from using patterns that are similar if they are not exact. But one learning inspiring the other is the synergy in my mind. So education. Second, something like rules for reuse. If this is like this, then don't even bother to go further because it's going to create a Pandora's box. So some kind of overarching statements. The other side of the integration is, oh yes, these are very similar applications and you can very successfully reuse this pattern, design pattern. So these are the kinds of thoughts in my mind to share with the participants as to how we should develop rules where synthesis, harmonization, interoperation, and integration are possible.
Let me make space for some of our audience, see if they have comments on that.
Oh, Janet is back. Okay, I'm glad. Janet, what is the synthesis you had in mind? Well, I mean, I'm not disturbing your train of thought, Gary. I think you are on right space, saying let's give them some time to think about not only what I have posted and told here, and Janet has told, and Mike has told, but let's see what other great comments we can get from audience who have much more very varied experience.
Any comments there?
Anybody, any thought?
Well, I just might start talking and let's see if I say something that stirs them to agree or disagree. But I think in the past, the idea of sharing, and you talk about rules for sharing and synthesizing, was sort of thinking about knowledge sort of as a static thing, sort of as a product you could just take. But we know that
Yes.
if you just look at this, you have to understand the metadata about it, for example. And if you think about it in terms of having been created from a variety of semantic resources, you might have to look at these other semantic resources as the basis for it. So it isn't as simple as sort of taking a piece here and there, although you can do that in OWL. I mean, you can import an OWL file, but often the issue is really the understanding, the human understanding goes behind that. And things like the vocabulary, the meanings that are in the vocabulary, the relations that are established, and things of that nature. So it turns out to be a bit more complicated. But again, in the spirit of what we're trying to do here, what James sort of outlined, is trying to make this as easy as possible, recognizing that there are a variety of contextual things that also are important, and good documentation, being able to see on the dashboard, for example, what the quality of an ontology is really important. So I'll leave that there and see what other people have to say.
Well, I have a somewhat different kind of question. I noticed that we seem to be constantly emphasizing the quality of the ontology, developing the ontology. I mean, the focus seems to be on the ontology. What about what you use the ontology for? Now, ultimately, it's just a means to an end. How do we make it easier for people to use ontologies for something other than just harmonizing ontologies?
Mm-hmm.
So, James, what do you think of this?
I wanted to make a similar point, Ken. Yeah, so fundamentally, the money in OBO comes from database projects that are funded by the NIH at different levels. And that's where the bulk of it comes from. And so each of these database projects is like, has all sorts of information about particular biological, biomedical experiments that were run, or whatever genotypes that were collected, phenotypes that were observed, and link these things together. And then what OBO has largely been focused on is building millions of classes that allow us to define kind of the types of these individual data items in these databases and group them together in the relevant ways and coordinate between databases that are kind of similar in similar domains so that we can do data integration, and then also so that we can do data like validation. So like day-to-day, that's what I get paid to do. I do data validation, data integration, quality control for scientific databases. And we're trying to use these open biomedical ontologies to get a bit of a free lunch, but maybe it's more like stone soup. So everyone throws in some ingredients and then we can reuse the combined whole that is better than any sum of any of the parts. And we don't tend to get funded directly for any of that stuff, but the funders do like data sharing. Well, nowadays NIH is starting to mandate data management and sharing plans, and they do like to see kind of the synergy of the different projects that they're paying for, working together, and the data kind of living on after those projects are done and after the data is shipped. And then in OBO, so a lot of the OBO tools aren't focused on exactly how you use the stuff in the database. Well, but they're focused on like, how do we actually collaborate in a community to develop these ontologies that are going to drive this data integration. And so things like ODK and Robot are about like, how do we use existing open source software development platforms like GitHub to efficiently manage these projects with like dozens or hundreds of contributors, and actually get this stuff kind of done when we're building ontologies with hundreds of thousands or millions of terms. And when I was, we've had presentations from like the nowhere graph people who were not doing that kind of thing, in part because they just don't seem to need a whole bunch of classes. They have a whole bunch of kind of instance data. But and I had a whole bunch of thoughts kind of going off there, but maybe I'll stop for a second. So what we actually use stuff for is data integration, data validation. And to some extent, our tools like ODK, Robot Oak, SSOM are about putting those ontologies together and then pulling out data so that we can put it into our validation tools. One thing we didn't talk about, LinkML, I put it in the chat, but that's a data validation tool that we're kind of, Chris Mungel's group is working on and several of us are contributing to. But yeah, ultimately, that's kind of the main use. And then in the future, I would like more scientists to be able to use the stuff for smaller scale projects, not like big databases. So I'd like them to be able to use ontologies more easily in their like whatever Jupyter notebooks or whatever, doing small scale analysis and in their Excel files. And stuff like Oak, Ontology Access Kit is trying to help them push in that direction, make everything accessible through Python. So those are some thoughts about how this stuff gets used and about maybe a bit of the disconnect in the tooling that we have versus some of the other things we've talked about in the Ontology Summit so far.
Very good, very good. I
Yeah,
also
that's-
see that Robert has put in some ideas of how the suite ontology was used as an intersection. So,
Yeah, I
Robert,
mean,
you want to comment?
there are many, many other ways that these ontologies can be used.
Yes.
It would be helpful if we would try to capture a bit more of that in our communique. So
I was, yes, Ken. Since
so
it is,
I'm putting this out to everybody that has been
Yes.
participating. Give examples to show us how this actually makes a difference. And perhaps in some cases, what advice you can give for how our ontologists can provide a better framework for use of these resources. So what can we still do to help researchers more? Is there more we can provide? What issues came up when people were attempting to use these resources for particular applications that perhaps we hadn't thought of? So what are the examples of applications? What more could we do? That would be really great to put in our communique.
Speaking of applications, this is a question for James and the other people who were on here from the Biomed, from OBO. What about knowledge graph? Essentially,
Very
knowledge
good.
graph.
Very good.
What about those applications? Where does the OBO Foundry sort of, what are examples of that type of creation?
Mm-hmm. So you saw us present on Ubergraph, which is one important application,
Right.
and that's linked to the Monarch project work, which also brings together lots of ontologies in Knowledge Graph. I'm going to be a bit spicy and say that I don't really care about knowledge graphs. I don't know what they are, other than like, I like RDF. I don't know what a knowledge graph is except erasing semantics and putting in too many more edges that I can't reason over. And so I don't tend to use knowledge graphs in my own stuff, but that's just to be a bit provocative for people.
So Jim is here. So does Ubergraph, and I recognize the meaning roughly of Uber. Is that for all of what has been done with the OBO Foundry ontologies, or are there other knowledge graphs, subsets, and things of that nature that might be created or are being created?
I guess I would say Ubergraph kind of represents the ontologies themselves in more of a knowledge graph style. But then I think would be plenty of things that I would call more knowledge graphs that are kind of more built in the OBO framework that are not ontologies, like the Monarch initiative knowledge graph, which connects genes to phenotypes and diseases. And so all the phenotypes and the diseases those terms are in OBO ontologies, but then they have the data or the knowledge statements that are saying like, this disease, is frequently associated with these phenotypes, and mutation of these genes causes these phenotypes. So that, I call that a knowledge graph. And then the gene ontology project is something that I'm working on. We have this GoCam thing, the Go causal activity models, and that's a collection of lots of sort of tiny knowledge graphs. So I guess they're knowledge graphs, but maybe taken together, it's all one. But that's much more in the OWL, where the kind of OWL semantics extends all the way down to the instances. So we make instances of the ontology classes and use the relations from the relation ontology and make like little instance models that you can use a reasoner on. And again, to say like, gene X has some activity which is occurring in the nucleus, and it's upstream of something else. So, but they're not in the ontology, these statements, because they're each one is more of an observation, like not a universal kind of relationship.
Right.
So,
What's the other?
So I thought,
Turbo.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Turbo is a clinical knowledge graph using
What's it
Obo
called?
stuff.
Turbo?
Yep, I'll put a link in the chat.
Great. So Jim, I thought you did a really good job of pointing out some of the issues in doing this, in creating UberGraph. And I was hoping that Christoph would actually sort of share some of the things that were difficult for him, or, commonality with you. He didn't really cover that at all as part of the nowhere graph. That would be an interesting sort of thing to compare and share. Do you have any understanding about some of what you found difficult, or things that you had to do to create the UberGraph, and how it relates to the nowhere graph?
I don't know that much about the technology in the nowhere graph. I would be interested in how it works. The UberGraph issues, mainly that's been ontology work, like running into strange inferences when we combine the ontologies, and then going back to the ontology projects and asking them to make a change, or maybe frequently it's something like misusing a term as far as domain and range on a property and getting some weird results. So it's been a lot of feedback, I think, back to the ontology projects. The technical thing that I really enjoyed working on with UberGraph is just the tool that computes all of the inferred existential relationships, and that is more of just a software
Jim,
development task.
you mean just the number of relationships or types as well?
Well, it's using standard OWL reasoning, so it's all the ones that are implied by OWL. But I wrote my own version of the ELK reasoner that works a little bit differently. It computes the same inferences, but it's just the way that it operates. It's a bit easier to materialize all of those edges, like if finger is part of hand and hand is part of arm, then you want to also output finger part of arm. And so all those things you can use the implications in Protege or something, but it's the tool I made just does it in a way that it can compute and output all of them in a reasonable amount of time. And so that was just more of a software development task.
Very good. Very good. Excellent. Yeah. If I may speak for a minute, I am thinking at a very audiovisual level of comparing, say, two knowledge graphs, and taking a clue from what you just said is look at some sort of chains, roots, and patterns that are similar in them or something. You see, what we are doing in different disciplines is using common English, right? For example. So we know how to reuse language in different disciplines. Can't we take that analogy a little further and say, These are micro theories like which are reusable. These are patterns these are links. This is a standalone module, etc. My mind is more on similarities and differences. So we learn how to take care of similarities and differences. Therefore, we can reuse from one discipline to the other. So any comments on that?
I mean, my main open ontology project is the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations, where we have weekly calls with scientists from a bunch of different bioscience disciplines, and we try and converge on shared terminology for describing our investigations. It is brutally hard. Like, people use the same word to mean different things. They use different words to mean the same things. Building any sort of consensus is just like an epic task. And so I don't know, I'm not, we make progress slowly over time, but I'm not super optimistic about that path.
James, they had a similar problem in the finance industry. People would argue round and round about words, and the way they unlocked it, Mike Atkin went to a meeting and said, well, you might be arguing about the words, but do you agree on what the meanings are? And they were like, oh yeah, we all know what the things are we're talking about. We just can't agree on the words. Well, fine, then stop doing vocabulary and start doing ontology, which is only about the concepts, and forget about the words. Let someone else worry about those.
Yeah, well, so we have logical definitions and textual definitions, right? But then someone new comes in and they look at the label and they start using the label, and then we explain, well, you got to read the definition, you got to look at the text, the logical definition. And then they're like, wait, that's not what I mean when I say assay. And I'm like, well,
so we look
and
at,
at least we have something to talk about, but it's not easy.
no, not easy, not at all easy, but we have learned, for example, we use conceptual, logical, physical data models in almost all disciplines, right? Whether it be enterprise level, whether it be biomedical level, whether it be, so for relational database kind of framework, we know how to use and reuse sort of patterns or diagrams, data dictionaries. Similarly, can we find, like I was giving example of microtheories, they are reusable. So are there modules of software that encapsulate knowledge up to a level, maybe elementary information level, which we can reuse in other disciplines? Because here we are concentrating, and also subdomains within subdomains, like you said, overlap is difficult. So clinical versus research biology, that sort of reuse or repurposing. It need not be reused. It's just what we learned here is of value to learn in the next area that we want to develop ontologies or knowledge sharing in.
I mean,
So
at a very practical level, there's a lot of push in OBO to have templates for kind of branches of your ontology, and they boil down to CSV files, spreadsheets, different columns, and then you have labels for the different columns, and then you use a tool to translate that into a class definition. And so that's one way of thinking about ontology design patterns, and that's something that we do. And then what we're trying to do is push that up one level to coordinate at across OBO, between OBO ontologies. And so at the COB level, design patterns that people would share among many different projects. Yeah, whatever, we're making progress. It's super difficult.
before we get to Robert, I just wanted to ask, was I correct that OTTR was mentioned in the slide and has been used?
Yeah. So we tend to use robot templates and DOS-DP templates, which both boil down to pretty simple spreadsheet, and they're not as complicated as Otter. Otter is much more sophisticated and has more theory behind it. So we've been aware of Otter for a while, and whatever. I work with Chris Kinderman, who's here on this call, and he's working in that group. And I'm looking forward to that talk by Martin when he can give it, but we haven't been actually using it yet. So it's like on the horizon as maybe the next level, maybe the next step of sophistication. But we are very, very mindful of what our users need. And Otter has been more than we need right now.
Great. Okay, that's a point for the future. Also, maybe you want to consider using LinkML as part of a topic for the next panel, the final panel. We haven't had a chance to cover that, so maybe that would be an addition that we could accommodate. And with that, let me turn to Robert.
Thanks, Gary. I just wanted to make a couple of observations or points for the sake of the audience, including any students or newcomers to Ontology. So some of the projects in the summit use upper ontologies such as Cobb and Obo, and so for any persons in the audience unfamiliar, the use of such external ontologies often imposes significant commitments and assumptions, and so any newcomer should be aware of that. So that high level of abstraction may not be desired, and so speaking to James's point about how some new users or some domain professionals who enter a project may not be reading a given definition of a term in a specific ontology. Likewise, often people don't look to see all of the imported ontologies at higher levels of abstraction, such as upper ontologies, and so they don't read all of the definitional commitments, all of the meaning commitments that go up the scale of abstraction. And that is critically important because you may be committing to something you don't agree with. You may be committing to an ideology or even a set of formal logical commitments that you don't actually agree with. And so that's critically important. And then I think we should also reiterate that, from the presentations, we have seen certain projects, and each project comes with its own assumptions and methodologies. And so for the sake of understanding that, for instance, with biomedical, we shouldn't exclusively associate the particular project of Obo with the biomedical discipline as a whole, because there are other projects, approaches, and other knowledge organization systems, other semantic systems, and so forth. So those are just some input. Over.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left in our regular time, and we certainly shouldn't go over in this sort of ad hoc session here. So anybody who wants to speak up, please do.
This is so wonderful. Thank you.
So, Mike, I was just going to mention something I popped in the chat earlier, that the ESG, environmental, sustainable and governance, environmental, social and governance, I never remember, becoming a big thing in the regulatory world and both in finance and in regulation generally. And some of the environmental things, there's one guy I've been working with who's been researching how you get biological data like soil organisms and so on, and integrate that data using ontologies to be able to have a common reporting structure that you can use in standard financial and government type of reporting. So that's a good example of being able to reuse some of these resources to take the same meanings, the same research the scientists have already figured out what everything is in that area, and being able to reuse it in finance, investment management. If you're investing in something, you need to know what its ESG credentials are and so on. So that knowledge starts to get a lot of reuse in a much broader field.
So yes, I can see that a broad concept like environment sort of connects things that are in the bio field with the things that are in both finance and earth science field. So it's a nice bridge, and so sort of a upper level for environment, which would sort of relate to Cobb and to other upper reference models, would be an interesting construct to make, and I'm sure it would be a lot of discussion. So with that, I think we are right on time, and we've had some useful inputs to this and some things to look forward to, including maybe LinkML as part of our eventual panel, and certainly Martin's presentation seems to be a connector to a variety of things. So I look forward to seeing all of you at the next couple of sessions, and also for people who will be able to help with the synthesis and eventually communicate. That would be great too. So with that, Ken, James, do you have anything else to add before we
No, just
adjourn?
thank you, Gary, for putting this together at the last minute. It's much appreciated.
Yeah,
Right.
that was heroic, Jerry.
It was a morning. But it's something I've been thinking about during whenever I go out for a walk. So I had a little bit of thought on that. So, and having done this before. So nice seeing everybody. Thanks for
And
hanging on. That was really noble of you. And we'll see you next week, I hope.
next week on schema.org.
Yes. Okay.